Good. Welcome. So tonight we're going to be talking about Edgar Cayce on creation. It's, let me see if I can find the right place for the microphone. I find it to be one of the foundational concepts from Cayce's work, and it has meant a tremendous amount to me. And I think every philosopher has that, who are we, where do we come from, and why are we here, and what's the purpose and meaning of life. And so that's what I'll be covering in the next hour. You'll leave at least knowing what Edgar Cayce had to say on that subject. But why don't we start once again? Let's just collect ourselves. Let's have a moment of silence. And in this silence, if you might call forward in your heart and mind your purpose for being here tonight. Thank you. Well, my purpose for being here tonight, once again, is to share this lecture on Edgar Cayce on creation. But behind that, I would have to say, is my deep enthusiasm that I've had for the Cayce work pretty much since I found out about it. It's transformed my life physically, mentally, spiritually. As you heard in the introduction, about 12 years ago, I left Boston to move here to Virginia Beach to be part of this work. So with that said, my evolution here with the Edgar Cayce work has taken me into hypnosis and into regression. And I was not born believing in reincarnation, meaning that my family's religious background was Catholic. And so the concept of reincarnation was not native to me, so to speak. I remember when I was reading There Is a River, which is, those of you, many of you know, but maybe some of you don't, that's the biography of Edgar Cayce, the only biography that was written during his lifetime. And when I was picking up that book, shortly after I had heard that lecture from Harmon Bro, as I was reading through it, I was loving the book until it got to reincarnation. And then that just, for some reason, it made me take pause. And I tried to figure out what was going on, why I was struggling with this concept of reincarnation. Now, when I was reading There Is a River, Shirley MacLaine's biography had come out on a limb, and she was getting lampooned for her belief in reincarnation. And so I think there was some part of my ego that was thinking that I didn't want to be lampooned or not be taken seriously, as if anyone was taking me seriously anyway. You know, I don't know who I thought I was. But someplace I had this ego that thought that would kind of make me even stranger than people already thought I was. But I decided that wasn't a good enough reason. And so I had studied Eastern religions. Reincarnation is part of Eastern, Buddhism and Hinduism. And so I wrestled with that, just kind of why is it part of these religious traditions and not necessarily with Christianity. Now, being raised Christian, I got comfortable with the belief that there is life after death, the eternal nature of the soul. But if your soul is eternal, it begs the question, well, what is your soul doing before birth? Do you have just one shot here on earth? Common sense, even video games, you get 3 lives at least. Really, you're going to get one turn, one life here on earth. And so that began to open my mind. Also, I think if we're going to believe in God, we want to believe that God is just and fair. If you don't care about justice or fairness, just keep your eyes on Washington, D.C. No political, both parties anyway. But if you're going to believe in God, a higher power, you want to believe that there's some kind of justice. And I think if we look at life on earth, like in the snapshot of right now, there's a whole range of what's going on from myself. I've not missed, I don't think I've missed very many meals my whole life, and that's not true around the globe. As a child, I grew up in a unique family environment. One of those, I think every family is unique, but the flavor of unique of my family was that my father really wanted us to see what was going on in the world. He didn't want us just to be, but both my parents were psychiatrists, so we were upper middle class, but he was worried that that would become our lens, that we would see the world. And so my father was born and raised in France. In 1964, he had British Leyland custom build a Land Rover for our family that could sleep 6 people. And bulletproof glass, 2 gas tanks. My father was a soldier, so we were armed, and he was a doctor, so we had medication. So we could heal or kill. It was your choice. We didn't shoot anybody. But we went from Paris all the way across Eastern Europe, crossed the Mediterranean, across North Africa, through the Rock of Gibraltar, Spain, back to Paris. I was about 6 or 7 years old when I went to first grade. What did you do this summer? Oh, I saw where Jesus was born. I saw the pyramids. Oh, what a nice imagination this little boy has. Actually, that's what happened that summer. But I remember vividly one time seeing a man, a beggar, on the street. And he was just, he had a hat or something in front of him. And as we walked past him, I got very drawn to his eyes. Like they seemed like they were moving. His eyes seemed alive. And so as I focused in further, I saw that they were flies. He had flies in his eyes, and he just didn't have it anymore to shoo them away. He's just begging. And that stayed in my mind, not as a traumatic memory, but as kind of the rain, what's going on earth. Here I am, and there's someone begging who doesn't even have it to shoo insects away from them. So if we're going to believe in a just God, how do we put that's going on at the same time that this is going on? One possibility is that we get opportunities. Eastern religions say that we move through these different experiences, that each of us, that I've had experiences as a woman. I've had experiences at all the different range of the economic situation. And from a Buddhist perspective, that's about learning compassion and growing in compassion. And so that slowly opened my mind up to the possibility of reincarnation. Now, Edgar Cayce also wrestled with the concept of reincarnation. Many of you know that early on, when he started doing these in-trance readings, he wasn't comfortable with this going into trance, giving up his free will and having people ask questions, and while he was unconscious. And so he made a commitment. He said, if he ever gave a reading that hurt someone, he would stop immediately. And if he ever gave a reading that went against his Christian beliefs, he would also stop immediately. And he never felt that he gave a reading that hurt anyone, but when reincarnation came forward, it made him take pause, because in his upbringing with the Bible and Christianity, he hadn't gotten, that wasn't part of what he had gotten familiar with. Eventually, he became more comfortable with that. He began to give life readings where he would talk about these readings would talk about people's past lives. I think that he was always reading the Bible. Many of you know that the only thing people ever saw Edgar Cayce read was the Bible or the newspaper. And he would read the Bible through from cover to cover one time for each year of his life. And in the Bible, there are possibilities of reincarnation. There are other, it's nothing definitive, but when Jesus says to the apostles, "Behold Elijah," and the apostles say they knew that he meant John. One possible interpretation of that is that Jesus was saying that John is the reincarnation of Elijah. Other ways of explaining that, but that was the beginning of how Edgar Cayce began to open himself up to the possibility of reincarnation. So let me now kind of go back to creation, to the story of who we are and why we are. In my kind of evolution, as I've gone about learning, my parents, Edgar Cayce says that we pick our parents. Before we're born, we pick the two individuals that we're going to incarnate through. Does anybody want to leave now? It was such a preposterous idea. Like, what? I chose these people? I've been running from them. But that's, I wrestled with that too. But if I was to have chosen my parents, they were both psychiatrists, they were both Catholic, and they were both interested in metaphysics. As you know, my great-grandmother was a medium. She lived to be 107, and she was like a grandmother to me. When you're a little boy and your great-grandmother has imaginary friends, she's pretty cool. I really like that. My imaginary friends got along well with hers. It was a happy family that we had. But choosing this family in this incarnation or this way, and I can see now that the work that I do really does incorporate those three aspects. But I think that as I've evolved into becoming a teacher of reincarnation and a teacher of hypnosis, I think it's important that why do this? Edgar Cayce would say, what difference does it make if you're lived and died and you're buried in your grandmother's backyard under a tree? What difference does that make? How is that important? What really matters is that you have the opportunity here and now to forgive something, to work through something, to let go of something. And so you don't necessarily have to believe in reincarnation to be able to do that. But in my work and with the work of Edgar Cayce, it sure was helpful to begin to see this bigger picture. Because what I've come to see and understand is that it's like one life comes in, like we come into the middle of a movie. That when we wake up in the middle of the movie, and as we go through the movie, we're trying to figure out, well, how come my sister doesn't get along with my mom, but my other sister gets along great with my mom? And then we're trying to figure out, why are all these dynamics happening? Have you ever seen a movie, walked in the middle? It takes you a while to figure out the storyline. But I think the reincarnation story goes back and tells you what came before that, and it begins to make some more sense. So in my path to Edgar Cayce, I remember studying the work of Carl Jung. And Carl Jung talks a lot about creation mythology or symbols. And what he's talked about that resonated with me is he says that when a culture loses its contact, when it loses its sense of meaning from where it's come from, its creation story, that society or that culture gets lost. And if you can look at, for example, what's happened in our country as the settlers kind of disconnected the native people from their creation story, about how that became very, very challenging. And then I think that what's helped the native people of this country and other countries is the reconnection to their creation story, not disconnecting, but reconnecting. And then I think our society, in some ways, has also disconnected from meaning through our creation story. I think that we don't all resonate with a sense of meaning and purpose. Cayce talks about you will live as long as your life has meaning and purpose. Once you lose meaning and purpose, you start to drift. The soul-body connection starts to drift. So it's from that place that I want to share with you this story of Cayce's version of creation. I'm not saying that it's the right one or the true one. It's a version. What I resonate with, before I came to Edgar Cayce, I was a student of world religions, a student of native traditions, of different ways of understanding God. And Edgar Cayce is considered, broadly considered the father of holistic medicine. If you look at Cayce's readings, it's holistic. Almost everything that he talks about is holistic. What I don't think he gets acknowledged about is that I also think that he talks about holistic theology, meaning that he talks about God in a broader view than any of the lenses of the religions. So even though Edgar Cayce was a devout Christian and he was looking at God through the lens of Christianity, the readings started to talk about aspects of God and creation that were non-Christian. The readings started talking about meditation, started talking about the Kundalini, started talking about karma. Karma is part of Christian teachings as well, but you start to get the sense of a holistic view of God. So I believe that the age-old story of the three blind individuals that come to the elephant, and then one touches the leg, one touches the trunk, and one touches the ear. And each one comes away with their own story of what the elephant is like. Oh, it's like a tree trunk. No, it's like paper. No, it's like a rope. And from their view, they're correct. But the holistic view, if you step back, the elephant is the total of that and more. And so I think that that's what's drawn me to the Cayce work, is that it gives this broader perspective. And I think the New Age is really about a broader perspective of God. I think all of us as souls have tired of the franchising of God. You know, my God can beat up your God. I think we're sick of that. We're sick of the Crusades or whatever religious war. You know, is that really, God has this big ego that he wants you to kill somebody to glorify? So I think we've gotten tired of that. And I think the New Age is really about that God is the God of all people. Even to Edgar Cayce, this was a growth. This was an evolution, because Cayce, again, devout Christian, he starts hearing about other religions, starts hearing about reincarnation and meditation, weren't part of his upbringing. They asked the question, well, what is the best religion? We're hearing about all this other stuff. What is the best religion? And the answer came back from Cayce in deep trance, from the holistic view. The answer was, the best religion would be the one that you would actually practice. Isn't that a great answer? It's like, if you're born to Muslim parents, why don't you try to be, the highest version of Islam? Or if you're born to Christian parents, why don't you study that? Try to be the best version of what you've incarnated to. And it might be if you really study religions, there's a lot that they have in common. Sometimes there's differences that we magnify. All right, so let's go back just with that preamble. Let's go to Cayce's version of creation. Who are we and where have we come from? So he talks about, in a very familiar way to what I grew up with in Christianity or Catholicism, it talks about how in the beginning it's all one, that God is oneness, that there's a consciousness of everything being connected, everything being one. And in that state, that God is this creative kind of organism or creative energy or consciousness, that there is some desire, it's almost like that the Creator is the only one that's conscious, that everything else in creation is somehow attuned to the oneness, but isn't conscious. And so God seeks conscious companionship. And so the way that it's put, that Cayce puts it, similar to the way I learned it as a child, is that God is lonely and seeks companionship. Now, wait a minute, Peter. God is lonely. What that's I have a problem with that, and I understand that if that was to be, in literature, that would be called a personification. If we say the moon longs for the light of day, that would be, we're saying that the moon has human feelings. So in some ways we're projecting human feelings onto God in desiring companionship. Now, what I'll also talk about in a minute is this beginning. Creation is the beginning of something. But I'm also going to talk to you about how everything is infinite. There's no beginning or no end. So you're like, well, okay, there's no beginning, no end, everything's infinite. Now you're saying there's a beginning, and now you're telling us God is lonely. This isn't really making sense. Now, when Cayce was asked that, he said, well, right now, your consciousness is locked into a three-dimensional world. That the way that you think is three-dimensional. You think of past, present, and future. And when you try to go into fourth, fifth, infinite dimensional consciousness, it isn't going to compute very well in a three-dimensional mind. So he said it's a little bit like when you ask these big questions about the Creator, what you're doing is you're asking, let's say, advanced nuclear physics. You're asking a question about that while you're in third grade. You're a third grader, and you're learning how to add and subtract, and you're asking a question about very advanced applied math. Now, what Cayce says is, how does somebody who understands applied math kind of dumb it down or simplify it for a third grader? And so that's what he says. Some of this stuff, if it was to be explained, it wouldn't make sense. So you guys understand, what do you guys understand? Lonely? And oh yeah, I know what it's like. I've missed people before. So God has that feeling. So we associate that makes sense to us. It's much more complicated, but as best we can grasp, that's what we can take in. So the Creator desires companionship, but a particular type of companionship. The Creator desires conscious companionship. And so what this creative experiment is that there's this creation of souls. So souls that in some way, aspects of the Creator that used to be just attuned to the Creator now become conscious and they assume free will. So it's a little bit like if each cell of your body was to become conscious. So you have unconscious, but let's say each cell, Cayce does say that each cell of our body has consciousness. So that already needs further definition. But it creates souls that are reflections of the whole, and they are given the gift or the ability of free will and creative aspect. And so this experiment, God is desiring that the souls that have been created, that are part of this oneness, that are now conscious, that they are given dominion over or ability to explore this infinite universe of worlds, is what Cayce calls it. Infinite universe of worlds. And the desire, the hope, is that there may be the desire for souls to return seeking conscious companionship. After having been there and done that there's somehow a desire to return to the Creator. It's a little bit like as above, so below. We desire conscious companionship as well. We desire with our couple, relationship with our children, that they go and that our partners have choosing us out of all the choices that they have there. If we have children, we hope that as they go into the world, that they come back, they go to make their lives, eventually they come back and visit. They don't stay too long, but we desire that they come back and share with us. So that's the beginning of this story. Okay, and in the beginning, it's like it's just trying to make it simple. In some ways, there was never a beginning and there was never an end. It's all in this oneness, but just for the sake of trying to understand it in a three-dimensional mind. So these souls are given this free will, creative ability, and they go out into this universe of worlds. And Cayce talks about how in this first phase of creation, that souls were almost like flocks of birds in a flock, or like schools of fish, just kind of traveled in a kind of oneness, moving around. And so some would kind of go, oh, I guess that group's going, oh, my school is going here. And so one school of fish came over to Blue Speaker World. And they learned all about Blue Speaker World, but that's not our story. Okay, so some other school of fish came over and explored Lamp World. Learned all about what's going on in Lamp World, but that's not our story. We, as a soul group, as this school of fish, came to this particular universe, and we're drawn to this little marble, this little green and blue marble, this earth. Now, as I was hearing this story, part of what came to my my mind was, why did we pick that? With all of this, why would we come? Have you ever seen those maps where they show the solar system, and then they show the galaxy, and then they show the clusters of galaxies, and they show the clusters of galaxies, and they say, you are here. It doesn't seem like this is like a downtown, universe. It seems to be like way the sticks of whatever this universe is about. But why did we pick this? Now, what Cayce goes on to explain is that we are also, we've been created for the desire for consciousness, for learning, for growth. And you grow in consciousness by experiencing difference. If you look at learning theory, it's a similar background. That which is different teaches you. And so what were we drawn to in this earth that was different? Well, the first thing that was different, and now difference creates language. Because if everything, let's say everything is blue, there's no consciousness of blue. Blue just is. But once there's a fleck of green or a fleck of white, then there starts to become differentiation, and then we start to notice these differences. I guess he's in trouble. Reminds me of myself as a boy. And so we begin to pick up these differences, and that begins to become differentiation and learning. So what happened? What was this earth like that drew us in? Now, the first kind of draw was that the earth was, quote unquote, material or physical. And soul consciousness, souls were non-physical or spiritual. And so there was this curiosity about this place where everything kind of had substance and was kind of thick. The best way to explain it, like in a three-dimensional way, is to say that it's like the souls are like steam, and then the earth is like ice. It's kind of water that's become material. And so this curiosity about this earth, and then Cayce says at the beginning it was like observing, noticing, and then he said souls realized that they could project into matter. And he said that was the beginning of the school of fish beginning to realize they had free will, because they were kind of looking at this earth, and then one of them kind of just plunged in to the earth, went into the material plane, and the other souls are like, oh, well, what happened? What was that? What did they just do? So the first soul came in and projected into whatever was going on here. Just went into like an amoeba. And just like, whoa, this is really weird. And then they'd come out. So Cayce said that was the beginning. It was just learning. We just kind of come in, and then we realized we were spiritual, and we'd pull out. And so, and then another, as we told, Cayce said this was the beginning of soul groups, because one soul, one of these that came out would talk about, oh my God, have you been in that thing? No. Have you been in that green stuff, that grass stuff? No. And that began to be the first soul groups, who we were around at the beginning of coming into the earth. So the other one would come into a blade of grass and go, oh, photosynthesis, I'm absorbing carbon dioxide. And, anyway, and then they'd come out. And that began to be this initial kind of curiosity, coming in to the physical and then coming out. Now, the next learning difference that was going on the earth is that the evolution that was going on in our planet was that creation was dividing into male and female. The soul doesn't have gender. Now we have to invent words. What does it mean not to be male? It means androgynous. So the soul is just really androgynous. And so they're projecting in, and they're coming out, and they're experiencing what it's like to be physical, but they're remembering that they're non-physical, they're spiritual. Now what happened, though, is that as they start to go into the animal kingdom that's dividing into masculine and feminine, they're coming into the cow. Experiencing that. And then they're going into the bull, Bull. And you know what happens there. The bull and the cow. Yeah, the birds and the bees. And Cayce talks about that was a draw. It's symbolically told in Adam and Eve. Just the moving into sexuality as part of this earth plane. It's not part of soul, but it was a draw. It created the deeper investment in the world. So what happens is that at the beginning, Cayce says that we would come in and then withdraw, but he said once this started to happen, he said we began to linger. And in that word linger, can you think about the trouble you've gotten into life? Has it been like I think I'll have one more beer. Yeah. What happens? 3 days later, you wake up somewhere, right? So it's that lingering quality. So that was part of this experience, beginning to linger and stay too long. And then what Cayce says is that we began to move more into this consciousness, and our soul consciousness began to recede into the subconscious. It's a little bit like we come from our soul nature. The truth of who we are is infinite. We have an infinite consciousness. But if we're going to come into this world, imagine that you have a mansion, that you come from a mansion of infinite rooms. Now you're going to move into the 3-bedroom apartment of Earth. right? You got a mansion, you're going to move into 3 bedrooms. How are you going to do it? How are you going to come into a 3-bedroom apartment? Well, you're going to have to put a lot into storage. You're going to have to simplify down to 3 dimensions into a 3-bedroom apartment. So what happens is all of the other stuff of you goes into the subconscious. And so that becomes what's happened. We've come into this 3-dimensional world. We've descended into matter. And the truth of who we are is now gone behind a veil into the subconscious mind. Souls began to forget from whence they came. Now, there's a reading where Cayce talks about how, remember, these school of fish, it's not like all of them jumped in. They were going in. A couple were going in, and some were kind of watching what was going on. And there's a reading where a soul is talking about, observing and saying, oh my God, what are they doing? They're building colonies. They were looking at, well, ants build colonies because they're from the earth. Bears live in caves because they're from the... What are these souls doing that they're building colonies? Like they're planning to stay. It sounds like these souls that had never been in the earth, it's a little bit like, as if you had gone on vacation. Let's say you go to vacation in Italy, right? And you're really enjoying it. So you say, you know what, I'm going to cancel my return trip. I'm going to stay another week. And let's say you say, before you know it, like you're just living in Italy. And your family's like, hey, where are you? You're like, no, don't bother me, I'm Italian. So that's what's happened, is that we've gotten so identified with here, we've forgotten from whence we have come. Now, compounding matters is that as souls moved into identity with the physical, is that part of that was that soul consciousness, remember at the beginning, is oneness. We are all one. We're all connected. There's no greater soul, there's no lesser soul. It's all one. But what happens as you come into this dimension, some are bigger, some are stronger, there becomes power, and there becomes hierarchies, and there becomes selfishness, and there becomes greed. That is non-spiritual behavior. That is separate behavior. That's where you think there's a difference between you and another. And so, but what that created though, okay, now we're moving along, what that creates is the activation of the law of karma. Because even though we're experimenting, exploring this place, there's spiritual law. Just as there's physical law, there's spiritual law. And spiritual law is that you reap what you sow. What you put out is going to come back to you. And so if you're being selfish and greedy, you're going to draw that to you. Now, the way that it's come to make sense to me is that when we first came in as the first little fish, Cayce says we were like stars in the morning sky, just so sweet and so pure. And we kind of came in and we started getting into the hydras, and we started getting into the cows, and we started getting into deeper and deeper. We got more and more aggressive, more and more identified with this. It's like we began to pick up what I call spiritual viruses, or non-spiritual behavior, selfishness, greed, those sorts of things. They create a mark on the soul. And so let's say after the life is over and there's the withdrawal. So you've had a life, you've kind of descended into matter, you've gotten caught up in the drama. Once you come out and go, oh my God, I'm done with that place. I don't want to go there ever again. What happens though is that it's told in the Bible where it says, if you have aught, if your prayer will not rise to meet its maker if you have aught against your brother and sister. Best you go back and make amends and then come back with your prayer. That prayer is your soul. As you're trying to kind of get out of here, you still have non-spiritual influence. You've been in this world, you've picked up something that's non-spiritual, and your prayer can't rise. You have to make amends. You have to come back. And then that becomes now the wheel of karma. That becomes how we have created the cycle of reincarnation. Now we have to go back and meet. Where there has been selfishness, there has to be kindness. Where there has been hate, there has to be love. So we have to come back to fix that and heal that. Now the Cayce story gets it's so vast. This is long, long periods of time of souls kind of incarnating. The souls that we're observing and wanting to be helpful, we're trying to figure out what to do. How do we help these souls that have gotten so lost? And so souls, the fish that hadn't come in would get together, and they said, well, what if we project into matter? What if we project into it, non-physically, like a hologram, and we remind them of where they come from? So imagine that there's a soul all the way out here in Arcturus, and they're like, I'm not going in that place. I'm just going to project. And so you pretend you're acting selfishly and greedy over there. And so, okay, there you go. You're doing a good job. And then here comes this projection, and it's like, don't do it. There's spiritual law. You're a soul. Forgive. You'll pay. Okay. And what happened in that story is that Cayce says the souls on earth said, hey, Casper, get lost. You don't know what's going on here. So I'm making it simplified, but there was an original kind of projection that didn't quite work. So then the second involution, the first involution came because of curiosity, and then there was a second involution of souls that tried to help souls come out. And those become, the ones that teach the way out. It has to do with how you undo the snares that have caught you here in the earth. So that the teachers, the second involution, have come trying to teach forgiveness. That's the master law of grace, trying to teach compassion so that you can release this stuff. Like, for example, there's a reading where a mother was beside herself because she and her husband had a son together. And she felt that her husband was looking for every excuse to punish the child. And she said the little boy would do just normal stuff. And this guy, oh my God, we got to punish him, So she was tired of pulling her husband off of the boy that she saw as just being a boy, but her husband had this negative bias against him. So the reading Cayce gave, he says, what we have here in the just previous life was that your son was the father of your husband, and he was a cruel father. And your husband has the soul memory, which he calls karma, has the soul memory, and he was waiting with the switch to get even. So he's trying to get even. So what happens there, though? You see how karma works? They're trying to work something out together. But if the father abuses the son and then reincarnates and then it happens over and over again, that's the wheel of karma. At some point, one of those members has to say enough, has to say, I forgive, I let this go. And that's where you have Jesus' teachings. 80% of his teachings are about forgiveness. Before forgiveness, it's very helpful to understand compassion, to understand from whence we come. And so that becomes our story. In a nutshell, kind of told it briefly, that we have come in here out of curiosity and we've gotten caught up in non-spiritual behavior. And as we seek our return, as we seek to learn from this earth school, what we're trying to do is make amends. Now, sometimes it's hard. The drama oftentimes plays out in our family. Does anybody here have any complicated family relationships? No one. No, you're great. That's your soul group. That's where it comes out. You have some family members that you get along famously with. You have some family members where there's just a lot of challenge, lots of conflict. And you'll see how some people get along with others that don't get along with these. There's a very complex intertwining there. But the meaning of it, the purpose of life, is to try to figure out how to work those relationships out. Regression can be helpful with that, kind of getting a perspective of understanding what's come before. You can do it without that. Like, I'll tell you a story in my family with my sister. I have two sisters. I have an older sister, and growing up, I don't, like if I was to look at family pictures of our family, somehow I wouldn't see her in it. Like it was like, it wasn't toxic, but it was just, I don't remember my older sister that well from growing up. Now, when time went on, as she grew up and developed, she partnered with somebody that sought to seek a lot of boundaries. And, you know, boundaries are good, but there were issues within the family over whether these push-aways were too strong, whether my sister was getting isolated from the family. And my personal reaction was very angry. I was very much saying, my sister should know better. She shouldn't let this happen. And it's pretty toxic. And I remember talking to an enlightened friend here at the ARE, and they're saying, you know, why can't you just love your sister the way she is? You know, like, and I'm like, shut up, okay? Could you just shut up? Like, I know you're right, but don't rub it in my face. Yeah. You know that? You ever had that experience? Like, good advice isn't always that easy to take. I knew they were right, but I knew there was something there. Now remember, Cayce calls karma soul memory. So it must have been something that was fueling this strong intensity. So as you heard, I went to Brian Weiss's training in past life regression. And in the training, we undergo regression, and I see myself going to prayers in the morning. I saw myself going down the hallway. It was beautiful green land. I knew I was in Ireland, and I hated it. I just knew I was like, oh, prayers again. And I remember the prayers were rote. You know, half the priests were mentally ill. It was just like there was nowhere else to put them. You know, it was like all of us were here together and we were reading the Bible and praying and that sort of thing. It was very, very dead. So the person conducting the regression said, how did you get here? How did this happen? And then I saw myself as a 7-year-old boy with a little suitcase, and I was being left at the monastery, being left for adoption. My parents were releasing me. And I saw myself as this little boy just beside myself, so angry and so afraid. And then I saw my parents who were leaving me. It was my sister and her husband. That sense of abandonment. I'm not going to ever trust you again in this life. Will we come back? And so I saw that. But what happens when you do oftentimes in a regression, or I think healing, and you can do this in meditation, anything that takes you out of, you see, I think injury happens from the individual perspective, and I think healing happens from the oneness perspective. So in this story, I could see and feel the boy's feelings, but I could also experience and feel my sister's feelings. And she was crying. She was beside herself. I also understood Ireland at that time. As a little boy, I didn't know what was going on, but I understood that families were having lots and lots of children. The Catholic Church was encouraging this as a good factory for priests. Yeah, anyway, you can see where I have, this life, I still have some karma with Catholicism. I have to forgive them, maybe. But that's what was going on. It wasn't personal. I saw there were too many mouths to feed, and they felt that I was the strongest one able to survive. And I tell you, when I came out of that, I woke up to, oh, this is what's been going on with my sister. And I had put up a wall with her, and within a week I called her up, and we got together and enjoyed each other's company. And I felt like I had put the axe down. So that's one of the personal stories about how this has been very helpful to me. So that's, in a nutshell, that's all of our story. Each one of us was drawn to this marble, this earth. And we've come in many, many, many times. The people that are closest to us, the ones that we love and the ones that rub us the wrong way, are what we're here to do. And what I've come to learn is that the ego part of you, the finite part of you, wants shortcuts. But the soul part of you incarnated to work through these patterns that are keeping you incarnating. And so what you'll find is that if you run from a pattern, it's going to follow you. Have you ever, something going on with, we marry our mothers and marry our fathers? What's that about? Is that pathological? Psychology calls that a repetition compulsion. I think it's because you have to face that. Whatever's come up, see, oftentimes in childhood, that seed is planted of what the pattern is, and then you continue to meet it with other people. If you run from them, good luck with that one. It's going to follow you. And you know, I do couples therapy. People say, you know, I dated this guy for 6 months. I checked him up and down, made sure he wasn't like my ex-husbands. I made sure that he didn't have it. And we got married a year later, and it happened. He turned into exactly the same pattern. You know what I'm talking about? You see, because I think what happens is when we go out there, let's say we go out and date, you know, on the conscious ego level, we're like, oh, he's pretty, or he's handsome, she's pretty, oh, they're nice, oh, he's good to his kids, he's good to his mom. Yeah, that's what we're seeing consciously. But on the unconscious level, you know, I got codependent self-esteem issues. I'm looking for an addict. Anyone here? Oh, I'm an addict. I've got real problems with thinking about others. Okay, we want to work that out together? And I think that that's how people partner. And you're like, what? Because the soul wants to work out those patterns. You want to figure out, what have I got to do here and now with it? The phones ring when I speak truth. So that's the story. That's what we're here working to do. With our soul groups, with these patterns, how we've come in, the role that karma plays. And I find it, you know, there's resources, you know, whether you use meditation or regression or hypnosis, dreams, they're all going to be helping you move into your oneness perspective so that you can figure out how to work through this stuff. Now, let me just, I'll take some questions, and let me just wrap up with how this plays out in the psyche. You know, how this plays out with our symbols and with our mythology. The story of the prodigal child, the prodigal son, the prodigal daughter, is part of our literature, it's part of our movies, it's the Wizard of Oz, it's all this of being home, you know, Dorothy in Kansas, and then she gets lost, she goes, you know, she wants to be home again, and then she makes her way home. Oh, feels so good to be home. This is in our psyche, and it's in the teachings, in the Christian teachings of the prodigal child. Now let me tell you this story, and let's see how it relates to what we've talked about. So the story of the prodigal child is that there are parents that have 2 children. And they're a wealthy family, they have all kinds of resources. And one of the kids steps up and says, you know, I've been thinking about this, Mom and Dad. I'd like half of everything. I'd like, bless you, I'd like you guys to sell everything. I want my half now. I don't wait till you die. That's going to be a long time. I want it now. All right, what do you do if you ever had a kid come up to you? Well, you'd sell everything, right? Sell it and give them half. Right? Don't you do that? Well, that's what happens in this story, right? Maybe you stopped reading the story right there. This is bull. What kind of story is this? Well, that's the story. So the parent, oh, yes, we're going to sell everything and give you half. Okay? So they're giving half. And what happens to the kid, right? Kid's like, yay, I got money, I got fun, I got that. And it gives it out, expends it. And then the end of the story, or the middle of the story, they end up with the pigs, right? They end up like, how the heck did I get here? You know, I had so much, and now I'm in this hole. You know, I got nothing here. I'm eating garbage. This is not the way I planned this to go. Anybody ever felt that way? This is not the way I planned my life to go, and you're in this moment. And so what does the child do, though? The child reflects and says, you know, I came from a place that was better than this. You know, I wonder if I was to make my way back. You know, would they take me back? Like, could I even be a servant at this place? Could I do that? And so in this reflection, the child says, okay, I'm going to go back. And so they begin to make the long voyage back, you know. And then what happens over here? Remember, these parents are weird, right? What do? They're like, oh, you? I was waiting for you to come back. No, that's not how they do. That's right. That's how it might make sense. No, they're like, oh, he's back. He comes. Send him the robe. Let's kill the fatted calf. Right? So, and then the kid's like, what? You're giving me a robe? I'm like, I just wasted half of your money. What am I going to do? Right? So that story, though, sometimes we forget that there's a second child. Remember that story? What's the second child like? They're like, oh, are you kidding me? That's my fatted calf, and that's my robe. This isn't happening. Right? That's the consciousness of the second child. So there's one that went and came back, and there's one that stayed, right? Now let's go back to the beginning. Remember, the Creator is seeking conscious companionship, wants us to be given this free will and go on this adventure, hoping that we'll come back. Which one of these two would you rather talk with, spend time? Which one is a better conscious companion? The one who came back, right? The one who stayed, what's that consciousness? Kind of immature, right? Kind of entitled. And that was the consciousness leaving, wasn't it? It's like, yay, kind of an immature consciousness. What was the consciousness coming back? Humble. Having learned, having grown, maybe asking forgiveness, just saying. Now, which one of those two appreciates home? The one that left and come back. Now, that's our story. That's the purpose of this, of our creation, that we would go and that we would come back, that we would come back as conscious companions with our Creator. But in this story is our soul voyage is that we have all been great saints and great sinners. This story is not about shame. If this son had stayed ashamed, he would have never gone back. How did he go back? He had to humble himself. He had to say, okay, I'm gonna face it. I'm gonna face my karma. I'm gonna face whatever comes to me. But they didn't stay locked in shame. You see, I think that shame is a toxic emotion, if not the toxic emotion. This story of creation is not about shame at all. Everything that we've ever done and been is part of our soul growth and our soul evolution. In a regression, I learned about redemption. Redemption, we all know what redemption is. It's like, redemption is what makes the essential teaching of Christianity that's different than any other religion. Redemption. What is redemption exactly? Well, I had a woman come to me from Scotland, and she had vivid memories, dreams of the Crusades. And she was now in her 70s, and she says, I've got to face this. I want to do a regression to face what I did during the Crusades. Now, she was anxious and apprehensive. Usually people come for regression and they're happy and excited. So she's anxious and apprehensive. That makes me anxious and apprehensive. We're kind of going through the experience. And then she gets to the door and she says, earlier I saw a gold key. Can I go get that instead of going through the door? I said, no, you must go through the door. No, I didn't. I wrote, in an article I wrote, I tried to make that joke. The editor didn't get the joke. There's people out there that think I'm the kamikaze regressionist. Go through, no, you have no free will, do it. So I told her, of course, she could go find the gold key. And so she finds the gold key. As soon as she finds the key, she says, this belongs to a treasure chest. She opens up the treasure chest. Inside is a ruby heart, a pendant. And she says, oh, this is a gift for me from Jesus. She just knew intuitively. And she put on the pendant. It seems like when it overlapped with the heart chakra, then she began to have visual memory. And she says she was describing seeing Jesus from behind. She saw Jesus with children. And as she was kind of adjusting to this, Jesus became aware of her and turned to her and without words just communicated to her, all that matters is who you are now. You're a good person. Whatever happened in the crazy time of the Crusades, that's part of history. You've learned, you've grown. All that matters is who you are now. That's redemption. All that matters is who you are now. And that's the liberating theology of Jesus, I believe, is that this prodigal son, you make your way back. If you've hurt people, we've all done wrong things. If you've done it enough times, if you learn from it and you don't want to do it anymore, then it's okay. Then you move forward. I think most of us have done junky stuff a lot of times, and then that's part of what karma is. We slowly are there to learn and grow from it. And so I share that just as a closing thought, just about letting go of shame. It's not guilt. If you want to look at the work of Brene Brown, who does a lot of research with shame, guilt is useful because guilt means you've done something wrong. We all do wrong stuff, but when you've done something wrong, you can make amends. It's a behavior, it's an action, but shame becomes who you are. And once you feel ashamed that you are basically a bad person, that doesn't become solvable. And shame then becomes the seed of all these pain-killing behaviors that we see. All the addictions become connected to this sense of, I am fundamentally broken, and I cannot tolerate to look at that, and so I need to blind myself from that. And that's where if you address these things, people get very defensive because I don't want to talk about it because it's unfixable. Don't you realize I'm not fixable? And that's where this story comes in. No, that's not true. These are all behaviors. None of us is essentially bad. We've done wrong things. We've hurt other people. We've paid a price for it, and we can make amends and continue our voyage. It's about redemption. And so that's just the overarching story, the prodigal son, where we've come from, what we're here doing, maybe in a brief way. But that's what I'd hope to share with you. It's Cayce's view of how to make life more understandable, a little bit easier. And I've found that this story and its application has helped me tremendously. And so I share it with you in that hope. So, thank you. Thank you.